Russia has admitted suffering the deadliest strike on its troops since Putin launched his full-scale invasion of Ukraine 10 months ago. The Kremlin has confirmed that 63 of its soldiers were killed in a series of strikes on a temporary barracks in the eastern Donetsk region. The Ukrainian Defense Forces have claimed responsibility for the New Year's Eve attack and say the true death toll is much higher. This footage shows the aftermath of the strike. Russian media have sharply criticized the senior officers involved. Here's part of the Kremlin's rare admission 2 days after the attack.
The Kyiv regime targeted a temporary deployment point of one of the units of the Russian armed forces near the settlement of Makiivka in the Donetsk People's Republic, with 6 rockets of US-made HIMARS multiple rocket launchers. Russian air defense systems shot down 2 HIMARS rockets as a result of the strike of 4 missiles with a high explosive warhead at a temporary deployment point. 63 Russian servicemen were killed. All necessary assistance and support will be provided to the relatives and friends of the killed servicemen.
Samuel Ramani joins me now for more. He teaches politics and international relations at the University of Oxford. He's also the author of the forthcoming book, Putin's War on Ukraine, Russia's Campaign for Global Counter-Revolution. Mr. Ramani, good to see you again. Welcome to the day. How remarkable is it that Russia would acknowledge a loss of this magnitude?
Well, it is very, very remarkable because Russia usually cloaks its casualty figures under numbers like heavy losses, which is something that Dmitry Peskov has often used as an expression, and it very infrequently updates the number of deaths. And if you take an example of this, there was an attack on Wagner Group mercenaries in Kamdash, Syria, 4 years ago, and the Russians claimed only 5 people died, and actually 100 died. So acknowledging this level of casualties is quite unprecedented.
Criticism has been mounting in Russia against the military leadership. How has this attack in particular been received?
Well, I don't think that this attack has provoked the kind of ferocity of criticism against the military leadership that we saw after the withdrawals from Kharkiv or Kherson, or the attack even a week ago on Engels Air Base. But there have been some critical voices that have been coming, who was the former FSB colonel, who was one of the leading critics of the defense ministry, has talking about hundreds of casualties, so a lot more closely aligned with the Ukrainian estimates. And others have drawn attention to some of the operational mishaps that made this happen. Like, why did Russia concentrate so many forces in one place? Even though the area of Donetsk is so depopulated, there's so many abandoned buildings, they could have scattered them. Why haven't they built underground bunkers or underground fortifications? Why did they allow their cellular signal to be concentrated in one place so their identities could be given away? So there are criticisms of what's happened here, but it's not as fierce as I've seen them over the course of the past year.
You're, of course, following every movement on the battlefield very closely. Where do you see the war headed?
So right now, I think we're going through a bit of a pause, or a bit of a de-escalation in terms of actual acquisitions of new territory from either side. That doesn't mean that the intensity of the conflict is going to deteriorate. In fact, what we've seen from the first couple of days of the new year, as high intensity as it's ever been, but it's just very hard for either side to be able to achieve a major breakthrough. Ukraine's long-term goal is to probably recapture Zaporizhia, which via Melitopol, which is a key supply chain for the Russians, and also try to push for an advance in Crimea and Luhansk. But unlike the thousands of kilometers of advances that we've been seeing over the course in September and October, in Crimea, they're now advancing at only 2 kilometers a day, even according to Ukrainian estimates. Similarly, the Russians remain offensively stuck in Bakhmut and are focusing more on taking advantage of the difficult terrain by creating fortifications and even booby-trapping and mining areas they hold. So right now, the Russians are focusing on holding what they can and maybe winning Bakhmut. The Ukrainians are hoping for incremental gains in Zaporizhia and Luhansk. But it's a much slower pace, a much more attritional conflict than we've probably ever seen it.
Now, the big question we're trying to answer today is, will this war end in 2023? Do you think there is a chance that this year we'll see an end to this bloody conflict?
Well, there's certainly a chance, but it's impossible to really say. I think that if the Ukrainians are to recapture all of the territory that they took over, that they lost, since February 24th, they will want to try to capture the rest of Donbass and Crimea. The United States has said that they will 100% commit to supporting Ukraine's efforts to recapture its territory that was lost since 24th, but Ukraine would have to make its own judgment calls afterward. So much depends on at the level of Western support and the continuity of Western support if Ukraine wants to go and take a potential nuclear risk by attacking Crimea. And also much depends on Russia's desire to potentially negotiate an escape out of this. Right now, it seems as if the Russian negotiating position is that the Ukrainians have to recognize Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea as all part of Russia. And aside from Crimea, Russia doesn't even control any of those regions in their entirety. Yeah. So Russia's with an unrealistic and a very, very dangerous negotiating position. And the Ukrainians believe that this is their historic chance at victory. And that's why I could easily see this war spilling over in 2024.
And some analysts are actually saying that all of what you just described is putting Russia on course to become a failed state. Would you say they're right?
So it's hard to say whether a failed state is what it is. I think even in terms of economic decline, we're noticing maybe 2.9% decline in GDP and an attritional erosion of the country's long-term development prospects, especially outside of the natural resource sphere. But we're not witnessing the kind of greater than Great Depression type collapse in the Russian economy that we saw during the 1990s. The Russian ruble is showing some weakness now after months of strength, but it's nowhere near the 1998 ruble crisis. There's been obviously talk about Russia technically defaulting, but nothing at the level of the debt crisis that we saw in 1998. Or nor is there the kind of organized crime or the separatist movements in Chechnya are confined to limited protests and not to a civil war. So if Russia was not quite a failed state, but veering on a failed state during the 1990s, it certainly isn't there yet. But there is obviously the risk of greater internal unrest, potentially intra-elite schism if the war continues to go badly. And we have to watch those risks, particularly the dynamics between the Russian Defense Ministry, people like Shoigu and Gerasimov, and their most hawkish critics, like Kadyrov and Yevgeny Prigozhin of the Wagner Group.
Yeah. Interesting stuff. Samuel Romani of the University of Oxford, thank you so much. DW correspondent Roman Goncharenko is in Kyiv, and he told us earlier what he knew about the New Year's Eve attack in Makiivka.
Well, there are still not so many details. The Ukrainian Central Command mentioned that in its daily bulletin in the evening, saying that some 10 Russian vehicles, military vehicles, were destroyed or damaged, but saying that the number of casualties is still unknown. Before, the Ukrainian armed forces said that up to 400 Russian soldiers have been killed. The Russians are saying only 63, so there is a huge gap between those figures. And what is striking is the very harsh criticism of the Russian pro-government bloggers and pro-government commentators in social media. And this reminds of the situation in September when the Ukrainians started a counter-offensive in the region of Kyiv, which was absolutely unexpected for the Russians and could regain territory. So the level of criticism of the Russian military officials who decided to let those soldiers be accumulated in one place and then be killed, it is very striking. And some here in Kyiv also expect now probably a Russian retaliation because there were similar incidents in the past. And the situation is still very dynamic here in Kyiv.
Yeah, you talked about that discrepancy between the numbers that are being given by the Russian Defense Ministry and the Ukrainian forces. It is, whatever that number be, the biggest loss of life in a single event that the Kremlin is admitting to. How is this being received by the Ukrainian people?
Absolutely. So it reminds, it could be, or it is comparable in some opinions to sinking a big Russian ship like that Moskva flagship. On the other hand, the Ukrainian officials appear to be downplaying it, maybe to prevent further escalation. Because it looks like a really big thing, probably much more dead than the Russian officials are telling the public. And on the other hand, the Ukrainian social networks, of course, are rejoicing. They are happy because on that night Russia was continuing to strike Ukrainian territory, including the capital Kyiv, and the night after that as well. So Russia is putting more pressure on Ukraine, and so there was joy on the Ukrainian side to show that Russians are also suffering, and Ukraine is not just taking those Russian strikes and doing nothing. Because, as I've said, in the couple of days before that, Russia was putting more and more pressure on the Ukrainian civilian infrastructure.
Yeah, and among several other parts of the country, Kyiv has again come under intense Russian attack. What's the situation now?
At the moment, as we speak, it is relatively calm. During the day, it was a warm day, about 10 degrees plus centigrade. And there was a mixture, of resilience, a kind of a war situation as usual. So people seemed at least partially relaxed on the streets, just walking by, expecting the Orthodox Christmas in a few days. But on the other hand, during the evening and as the night began now, there is growing tension. There is an expectation of a further Russian attack by drones, Iranian drones, and Kyiv is obviously the most valuable target. So there's growing tension of what could happen at night and in the coming days.
DW correspondent Roman Goncharenko in Kyiv, many thanks and stay safe. For months now, Russia has focused on Bakhmut in the eastern Donbass region. The city has seen some of the most intense fighting of the war. These images from the Ukrainian National Guard show the result of the Russian onslaught. Much of the fighting is old-fashioned trench warfare. The front line often barely moves at all. Shelling is causing heavy losses on both sides as soldiers are pinned down in well-known locations. Medics do everything they can to save lives. And DW's Max Sanda joined an evacuation team on the Eastern Front.
Cheating death at high speed. When taking the injured from Ukrainian front lines, every second counts.
Tell me when you put your foot down, Andriy. I'm flying around back here.
They call her Kocha. It means little one. She isn't tall, but few can match her combat medic experience. She's working on a soldier whose vehicle was involved in an explosion.
Was this a ricochet?
No, we hit a mine. The driver threw me to the left, and I saw everything. He was thrown over the top. I had earplugs in and a helmet on. I hit my head, and I got hit in the chest.
The soldier will most likely fully recover. His driver is dead.
So we have some other things to take care of. Do you have children?
2.
So there must be 3 more.
He might be in an ambulance on the way to hospital, but his mind is still on the front.
Everyone thought that we would break, but in fact we stand and will continue to stand. All these raids, it only angers us more and makes everyone stronger.
It's been a grim day.
Today is a very difficult day. The enemy, the Russian aggressor, will not calm down. He sees the advantages on our side and fights harder and harder. However, I'm desperate because today, unfortunately, we had 20 but lost 3.
Finding the strength to face what is coming out of the Bakhmut area. For some of the Hospitallers, voluntary combat medics, faith is part of the answer. Krocha converted to Islam while working with Muslim volunteers in the field after hostilities began in 2014. She says she only fears God, but the job takes its toll.
What I have seen includes deaths and severed limbs, opened heads and stomachs. I put a barrier in front of me, so to speak. He is wounded, I work with him. And if I give up, how will that help him? So I hold on. I have 2 nephews at home. When I'm exhausted here, barely on my feet, and then I have a rotation, I go home, and seeing these nephews and other children fixes everything that can be fixed.
She has to return to the front, even though it's been quiet for a few days. Rain and low cloud have created poor conditions for artillery and drones. But in the distance, cannon fire. The weather has changed, and the next evacuation call may just be moments away.